Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out to our International and Defense Policy Speaker Series event today. It's our pleasure to welcome George Tkach to speak about his new book, Cold War 2.0. So to offer a bit of context for our speaker today, George is a former partner and national technology industry leader at the McCarthy Tétrault law firm, and has been an adjunct professor of computer law for over 20 years at the Osgoode Law School. His latest book project is Cold War 2.0, Technology and Geopolitics and What It Means for Canada and the Other Democracies, which provides, I guess, a first foray into more public writing that George is looking at doing to explain how changing technologies are influencing geopolitics. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming George.
So just to flesh that out for 1 second, because how does a reformed lawyer come to write about foreign politics or foreign policy and geopolitics? So after my undergrad, I actually went up to NIPSIA, and that was my first academic love, was international relations. And I was going to go and try out for the Foreign Service, and someone whispered in my ear and said, well, if you come in as a lawyer, you can help us negotiate law of the sea treaties and that sort of thing. And that sounded really interesting. So I went to law school, and then as life would have it, I spent a summer at Nortel, which if you were born sort of before 1970, you'll remember was a great Canadian company. And that's where I caught the technology bug and said goodbye to Ottawa and the Foreign Service. And I just happened to be articling at McCarthy's, which had the pioneer of computer law. So we had a bunch of tech clients. So that's how I got into tech. But now that I'm past my legal best before date, I'm back to my first love, which is international relations, but keeping the tech. So that's the sordid story for anybody who cares to think about it. So the book, it's actually Cold War 2.0, Artificial Intelligence in the New Battle Between China, Russia, and America. That title, not Cold War 2.0, I came up with that, but the little subtitle, that was a negotiation with my American publisher. I thought it was a little bit strong, but anyway, you have to do what you do when you write for a general audience, as I learned. But it's a bad news, good news kind of book. The bad news first, we are back in a Cold War. My argument in the book, some of you will disagree, and maybe during the Q&A we can talk about that. And the frame for it, and this follows the Biden approach to there are the democracies and there are the autocracies. And fundamentally, I think that's a sound analysis. In the Cold War I, it was a little bit more capitalism versus communism. And China today, we obviously still have the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, single party state. It falls down a little bit when you get to Russia. So I refined it to democracy versus autocracy. And for those of you that haven't taken Poli-Sci 101, here are the two differences. You need fair and free elections, you need human rights, you need rule of law with independent judges. That's democracy. Autocracy is sort of none of that. So that's kind of the framework of the players. Just in terms of the context, the first Cold War, starting right after the Second World War, ending with the East Bloc hiving off from the Soviet Union in 1989, the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union itself in 1991. This is a fun game. If we had more time, we could say, okay, for those of you who buy into the Cold War 2.0 paradigm. Well, when did it begin? My own view is that it was 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the insertion of little green men from Russia into the eastern part of Ukraine, but also China beginning to militarize the South China Sea. And I'll spend a little bit of time on that with some visuals. I think everybody in the room is way up the curve on Ukraine. South China Sea, a lot of people I find in Canada and in the US, not nearly where I believe they should be. Yesterday, I was moderating a session up in Ottawa, and a Canadian diplomat was talking about 2008 and what Russia was doing in Georgia. And she was at NATO and subsequently at the OSCE. And what she described about Russia is exactly what we're getting today, but with Ukraine. So if you were hard pressed and you wanted to press that PhD thesis defense, you'd say, well, it wasn't 2014, it was 2008. There's actually a school of thought that says Russia never really ended its Cold War. And there's another school of thought that says, well, this start date to the first one was really 1917, and so on and so forth. So of such things are wonderful Saturday afternoon teas constructed. But to finish the players, so it's China and Russia. They've flipped from Cold War I, when it was primarily Russia driving the communist autocratic boat. Now it's China. And there are some differences between the two Cold Wars. The Soviet Union never had an economy anywhere near the current state of China's in terms of volume, in terms of tech sophistication, in terms of manufacturing capacity, and so on. And the West, as we called the democracies in Cold War I, never attained a degree of interdependence and or dependency on the Soviet Union as we have with China today. And that plays into another front that I'll get to in a minute, which is Taiwan. Iran starting to show its willingness to punch above its weight class, getting much closer to Russia in terms of military technology, the Shahed drones, and getting military tech in return. And then what they've done with their sort of network of militias in the Middle East. But the other two fronts that, as I say, I just want to zip through, but the visuals are really quite stunning, is China in the South China Sea and China vis-a-vis Taiwan. Some up-and-comers. If you've been reading the literature coming out in the last 2-3 months on North Korea, a fundamental change on how that regime is starting to approach thinking about nuclear weapons, thinking about South Korea, and it really adds a dimension. They're also getting obviously very, very close to Moscow. Beijing doesn't like that. They always viewed North Korea as kind of their proxy. And if you were Kissinger and or a Kissinger clone, that presents again all sorts of neat opportunities for Washington. I don't get into those in the book, but they're fascinating dynamics for what's going on in that part of the world. There is a Canadian impact on Cold War 2.0. Just as Cold War I, actually, the first kickoff on Cold War I, do you do any interaction in these sessions? When I taught at law school, it was all Socratic method and so on. So just going on for like 40 minutes is kind of strange for me. But what was the event in Ottawa here, Trivial Pursuit? What was the event and the person, I'm virtually giving it away, that signaled the Canadians that there really was a Cold War and Canada was in the thick of it. Igor Gazenko. And do you remember his testimony with the paper bag on his head and so on? It's called witness protection in those days. And that's where we learned that the Russian embassy, the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, was running a cipher clerk system, and it was serious and it was widespread. And we were like, holy cow, like this is real, and we're in the middle of it. A good friend of mine lives in Sarnia, and a few months ago, massive ransomware hits against the healthcare system, Sarnia, Windsor, Chatham. Didn't kill anybody, but lots of anxiety and financial damage, et cetera, et cetera. Economic coercion. China has been doing that to Canada for years. It does it all over the world. Cognitive warfare, interference in domestic politics. You're all following, I hope, the commission on the interference in the 21 election, that sort of thing. Intellectual property theft. The summer I spent at Nortel, one of the cases I got to work on was a visiting group from China was at the Belleville printed circuit board plant. I'm going way back. There's no printed circuit board plant there anymore. But it was quite state of the art. And when the Chinese delegation came to say goodbye and they shook hands, a printed circuit board fell out of the fellow's sleeve. And I was tasked with looking up trade secrets, including in China, and et cetera, et cetera. So this has been going on. Professors, I used to do a fair amount of work for the engineering profs at U of T, and one of them sent me minutes after it was released in January. The feds have finally gotten around to telling university professors in the sciences and the engineering faculties, it's about 100 institutes on the list, mainly from China, some from Russia, some from Iran, that you can no longer do joint venture research with, or if it's somewhat related, you have to be very careful and so forth. So Cold War II, it's a Canadian issue. It's not just the world out there. Oh, and I don't know if you were devastated when AUKUS was announced and there was no C in the acronym. What a missed opportunity. It's about nuclear. We actually know something about nuclear on the civilian side. And it's going to be about AI. We actually know a fair bit about AI. It's going to be about quantum, which are 3 of the 4 technologies that I happen to talk about. So I kind of nailed it. But the point is, we're not in AUKUS, and we won't get those nuclear powered subs, which you need for sub-ice type activity. And the Russians and the Chinese have those nuclear power subs, and they're poking around in our north. And I'm not going to vent at this presentation. I'm just going to give you some of the facts. Okay, so this is the South China Sea. It's a big body of water. So here's China up at the top. Hainan is a big island off of China, but it's Chinese. You've got Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia around the south. You've got the Philippines coming up on the east. And the question for this part of the world is, how do you figure out the maritime boundaries pursuant to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea? And that's the blue. So the blue gives this territory, as it were, to the Chinese, particularly this so-called 200-kilometer or 200-mile exclusive economic zone, which was a fascinating concept dreamt up as part of UNCLOS, where it's not a maritime sea. That's only 12 miles. That's the first bit. this bigger bit, you don't own it, but you get to control fishing, you get to regulate deep sea mining, you get to regulate drilling for oil and that sort of thing. So the Chinese get some, Vietnam gets a big chunk because, of course, they're a long riparian state. Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines get a big chunk here. And this part in the middle is international waters. Anybody can sort of transit and so forth. Well, along comes China and says, no, 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 all this law of the sea stuff, not interested. That's the rules-based international order. That's just the US, being the hegemon around the world. And they drew a different line. Now, it's actually called the 9-dash line because it's 9 dashes that they put on the map. And they're saying everything inside of the 9-dash line, which is roughly 90% of the South China Sea, belongs to them. Now, this is their latest map from last year. And Taiwan's just a province of China. And they've added a dash. So if you're a purist and a lawyer, you actually call it now the 10-dash line. The Philippines, well, everybody goes non-linear down here because this is like an amazing grab by the Chinese. And the Philippines takes China to court, Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in 2016. They argue the case. They get a big, long judgment. To make a long story short, they fined for the Philippines. The Chinese didn't even show up in court. I know we're being recorded, so I have to be careful, but at least Trump shows up in court. I was going to try that line today. But the Chinese didn't show up in court. They've ignored the decision. Again, it's just an American-influenced approach to the world. Their approach is basically, we're big, we get to be able to do things like this. The best analysis of this phenomenon is in the Peloponnesian War, written by Thucydides 2,500 years ago. I cite to it in the book, and it's age-old. Basically, the big countries do as they wish. The little countries just suffer the consequences. So this is the new order that China would like to see roll out. Russia as well in their sphere of influence. And then it's not just claiming it, they then militarize it. So this is Mischief Reef, very aptly named. This is the before shot. It's a wonderful little atoll off the Philippines. Green palm trees swaying in the breeze. It's just, idyllic. This is the same reef today. 3.1 kilometer airstrip, military grade, missile batteries, hangars for the planes, large radar installations. China's been busy. And where this one is right around here. So it's well inside the Philippines exclusive economic zone. The one that you're reading about now, where the Philippines have grounded that ship and then are resupplying it and finally starting to push back on the Chinese, that's up here in the Scarborough Shoal area. Now, the reason this actually gets really delicate is the Philippines is a mutual defense alliance country with the Americans. So if the Chinese start sinking Filipino Coast Guard ships and so on, the Americans are obliged, it's kind of like an Article 5 NATO obligation, they're obliged to show up with the American Navy. Interestingly, Japan is also getting in the piece. In addition to development assistance, Japan is now supplying a number of countries in the region with military build assistance. So Japan is paying for a bunch of Coast Guard ships being built for the Philippine Coast Guard. And so they're starting to push back. So this is going to be a flashpoint. Keep an eye on it. Oh, and the reason the South China Sea is so critical, this is a sort of a scale. Yellow means it's the busiest traffic, container traffic, and so on. Roughly half of the world's container ships ply this route. So you come from Europe, Middle East, you come through the Malacca Strait, and then you go into the South China Sea to hit China, Philippines, Taiwan, and Japan and South Korea. So if you're China, if you can bottle up the South China Sea and you can get tribute flowing by way of taxes, levies, that sort of thing, you're back to where China was 2,000 to 3,000 years ago when they were able to get all the states around it to pay tribute to them. Okay, the other one I said I wanted to just quickly give you a sense of is Taiwan. And I talk about Taiwan in the book, but before researching and writing the book, I had a general sense that Taiwan was democratic and that it was important for tech. I'd done a bunch of deals with Taiwanese companies, but I didn't have the full picture, and it's really quite an astounding picture. So it's a small little island off the coast of China. And as small as it is, 3/4 of it is virtually uninhabitable. All this white part you see with the physical map is forested mountains. So the 24 million people in Taiwan actually live on this little 1/4 strip. But even up here in Taipei, which is the capital, you can see the mountains all around. And it's not until you get down to sort of Tainan and Taichung around here that it actually really does open up. Geostrategically and from a military tactics perspective, it's very, very important that all the ports are on the western side. The eastern side is beautiful. I was there a couple of months ago, and it's just great. My wife and I, we sort of drove the whole island. You can do it pretty quickly because it's so small. This is a gorgeous drive if you've driven the Cabot Trail, you know, down in the Maritimes and so on. But you could not do an amphibious landing here. And even if you could, the roads are so small, you couldn't kind of get off the coast. So all the action, if there is an invasion, is going to be on the west side, which is only 160 kilometers from China. So when you think of a naval blockade on Taiwan by China, don't think Cuban Missile Crisis type blockade. There won't be a ring of Chinese ships floating here. It's all cruise missile and other batteries for indirect fire from here and precision fire, keeping these ports from accepting, you know, the last 10 kilometers of delivery. So think of it more as a knife fight than sort of a 300-kilometer fight in the middle of the Pacific. And, well, but within this little sliver of inhabitable land, the Taiwanese have built an economic juggernaut, particularly in the technology space. This one is showing you Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing companies' plants in Taiwan. This is where it all began in Hsinchu Science Park. It's a fascinating story. Basically, a founder, Morris Chang, who was originally born in China, but worked in California, schooled in California, was kind of lured to Taiwan when there was nothing here. And he built a science park equivalent to the Stanford Science Park in the Valley. And today, TSMC has 92% of the production of the high-end semiconductor chips, the so-called 7 nanometer and more powerful. And these fab complexes, you really have to go and experience it. These are huge buildings. They're like 6 stories tall. Each one of these is like 3 or 4 football fields across and long. They're connected by sort of conveyor belts between them. And the big thing about chips, they're important in and of themselves, but they're also the technical infrastructure you need to do artificial intelligence. So NVIDIA, if you're following them, had breakout numbers, quarterly numbers a few days ago. They designed those chips in the States, Jensen Huang's company, who, by the way, was born in Taiwan. But all of his chips are made here in Taiwan. Apple, there's maybe 8 really important chips in an iPhone. There's a bunch of other ones less important. All those chips are made here. So this is I think, the most technologically important bit of real estate in the world right now. And it makes for a fascinating war game simulation scenario. If the Chinese were to take over the island, would they keep these from being destroyed? Or would they destroy, like you can go through all sorts of scenarios. So this is the other front that you need to keep an eye on for, because in addition to the technology, Taiwan is a vigorous democracy. If you followed their elections in January, they're ranked 10th on the democracy scale, ahead of Canada, ahead of France, ahead of the US, ahead of the UK. There were 3 people running for president. And they counted the votes. The 2 losers graciously conceded. It was a wonderful transition of power, as it were, to the new generation of the same party. A vibrant civil society, lots of room for independent groups to flourish, personal freedoms, whether it's gender equality, sexual preference. The people are decent. I have 3 or 4 examples of just being blown away by, they remind me of Canadians a lot, actually. Polite, decent, honest. Quite a clean government at the federal level, very little corruption. A little corruption down at the municipal level, but not a lot. A healthcare system that looks a lot like ours, not like the Chinese system. An outsized investment in education because they need to feed the tech industry. And all of this, of course, drives the Chinese nuts, because this is not what you find in China. And to have a Han Chinese majority country right on the doorstep that's doing better economically, and they get to consent, right? A democracy is where the people own the government, as opposed to an autocracy where the government owns the people. This is a huge threat to the CCP in China, just as Ukraine was a huge threat to Russia. And you're getting not full-on kinetic activity, but you're getting missiles being launched, and they go right over Taiwan. They land in the waters on the eastern side. This is sort of a median line, and you get jet fighter aircraft from China crossing the median line. And then it used to be they just crossed and then went back. Now they cross up north, And they fly all the way down the coast, and then they go back. When Nancy Pelosi visited in August of 2022, it was basically a 4-day shutdown of the island. And the island has virtually no fossil fuel capability of its own resources. They have sort of 2 weeks of storage. Their food poor in terms of how much agriculture they have. So basically, if they're not relieved within 2 to 3 weeks, they're gone. And think about it. If you think about it in the context of Ukraine, there's no Poland. If things get hot because China continues to insist that they want to absorb Taiwan, and if there were a military operation, there's nowhere for people to go. I mean, you know, the elderly, the women, the children, there's nowhere to go. And they're all packed into this quarter of the island. It would just be an absolute disaster. And no commercial plane is going to fly in at that point. The ships are not going to come. It's just, so the question becomes, who's going to stand with Taiwan? I'm actually writing my second book on Taiwan with a view to convincing people like you, particularly in the US. Again, it's American-aimed book. Don't go isolationist on Taiwan. I mean, they shouldn't go isolationist on Ukraine either. But I'm very worried that they will go isolationist on Taiwan because it's so far away. It's just not psychologically relevant to them. And this is why the US is so important. Now, this is a little bit out of date, and some of these bases are no longer. But this is why the US is the indispensable democracy. I'm fairly certain that if Biden's reelected, he will join in the defense of Taiwan with boots on the ground, as opposed to just providing material. I'm pretty sure the Japanese will join as well. The base in Okinawa, 58,000 American troops. They'll be launching a bunch of missiles from there, so they'll be attracting a bunch of missiles from China. They'll pretty quickly kill thousands of Japanese civilians who work on the base. So I think Japan is in. I don't think the South Koreans are in. They've got their hands full just keeping an eye on North Korea. And it's an open question whether the Philippines are in. They've sort of turned it around and have been much more receptive to the Americans. They've allowed them to forward deploy a bunch of air defense assets in the most northern island in Luzon. I think the British will be there, not with a lot, but they're always there. The French and the Germans have been exercising getting air assets there within 24 hours. So they might be there a little bit. We'll leave it for Q&A whether you think Canada will be there. Okay, so just very quickly, this Cold War, and I've outlined a few of the fronts. That's the Cold War part. The two is to differentiate it from Cold War I. You know, for the longest time, World War I wasn't World War I. It was just the Great War. And then when we had another World War, they said, oh, well, I guess the first one, and that's when the nomenclature happened. So, but it's not just 2, it's 2.0 to give it the sense that the technology is going to be very, very important. I focus in the book on AI, semiconductor chips, quantum, and also biotech, which a lot of people are uncomfortable with in terms of its, you know, full-on, you know, geopolitical, strategic implications. These are very important technologies, partly because they're accelerator technologies. When you mix AI and semiconductor chips, you get really amazing biotech drug discovery, for instance. Another feature of these four technologies is the so-called fusion. They're dual use. And we've had dual use for centuries, but these ones, you can literally use the NVIDIA chips off the commercial assembly line and plug them into missiles. I mean, it's just that dual use. And that makes, sanctions policy much more complex and frankly problematic. And what I do in the book, and I'll pass it around, is in trying to assess who's who in the zoo in terms of capability, you'll see some studies that look at scientific papers. There's a recent study out of Australia by ASPE that looks only at scientific papers and concludes that the Chinese are ahead in 16 of 20 technology categories. There are other professors who look at patents. I don't look at either of those. After 35 years of working with companies, tech companies on their patent portfolios, patents can be very imprecise as a measure of capability. There are some good patents, some less useful patents. Nortel, which ultimately went bankrupt, had a marvelous patent portfolio. So what I look at is market cap and sales, because you can't game these two items. You're either in the market with a product that's making money, which is sales, or you've got a public capital market imprimatur about how much you're worth, or you've raised a ton of private equity, venture cap, whatever the source of money is. So ignore my high-tech placeholder. It's all that I could find on the food table. I've opened it up to the semiconductor chip section chapter, and you'll see how I work it with sort of revenues and market cap. And the bottom line, and this is the good news. Oh, I also have a chapter in a much more concise way that looks at these other industries. They're not as critical as the big four, but they're still important. Some of them are a little more future-oriented, fusion. Some are like right today. The bottom line, when you look at all of these taken together, and this is a core thesis of the book, the good news is that democracies do innovation not just better, but way better than the autocracies. And there's a number of reasons for that, which I'm running out of time, so I won't go into it. Some of them are market-oriented, structural, some are social. And this is actually why I wrote the book. After 2014, I was so disturbed at the tepid response of the West. And in my practice, I was seeing how technologically the West was just head and tails above the Chinese and the Russians, let alone the Iranians and so on. And yet, how come we weren't getting the bang for our buck, as it were? Because all these technologies, the big ones as well as the little ones, they drive economic power and military power. So if you want to just have a peek at how I do it, that's going to be a point of contention, but I welcome it because that's how we move forward on these things. So this is what I concluded. I said, well, it's not enough to have great technology. You need to do some other things really, really well. And we do alliances really, really well. I mean, NATO is a pretty good example. I think AUKUS is now the gold standard. again, I want to get into it, but what they're doing to allow the US to share nuclear propulsion technology with the Australians and so on, it's fascinating. The Russians tried it with the Chinese. CR means China Russia 929. It crashed and burned. The Russians were going to bring aircraft engines to the party. It's one of these other technologies that's super critical, actually. And the Chinese tried for decades. They just couldn't make an aircraft engine for civilian. It fell apart because the Russians felt the Chinese were ripping them off, which was absolutely true. And they've now announced the commercial version of the C919, big fanfare and so on. The Chinese built the fuselage, they built the wings, and they assemble the final plane. The engines come from a democracy. The avionics come from a democracy. There's about 15 high-tech components that all come from democracies. Interesting question whether we should be giving the Chinese the permission to buy those components from us. Just a quick one. It's one thing to invent the best mousetrap. It's another to build it at scale. And there we are way behind. I mean, Russia has moved to a full-on war economy footing. And the Europeans are still trying to figure out, okay, should we rationalize and have one country do 155 ammo and another country do cruise missiles? No. Everybody's got to make everything. And it's just a complete hash. So in our own democracy are a number of the seeds being sown for our own demise. And this is one area where we're just not keeping up. I'm completely in love with the South Koreans, though. Thank God they're on our side. If you look at Poland, they have put in orders for about 40 billion US of new kit, half of which is being made in South Korea. Brilliant. Hanwha, keep an eye on Hanwha. Just like Kia and Hyundai, again, dual use as it were. Yeah, it's not a Mercedes, it's not a BMW, it's not even an Audi, but it's 80% of those at 60% of the cost, and they've done the same thing for military weaponry and so on. And that's why it's in the US national interest to make sure that, you know, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan stay safe. The book then talks about some other proposals, reforming the Security Council. I'd like to see NATO expand globally for historic, interesting reasons. We have a NATO in Europe, but we don't have a NATO equivalent in the Pacific. Instead, we have a US hub and spoke system. So the US has a treaty with South Korea. They have a treaty with Japan. They have a treaty with Australia. They have a treaty with the Philippines, a treaty with Thailand. But if the US goes full-on isolationist in the Pacific, as they may well under Trump in NATO, there's no remaining collective security mechanism in the Pacific the way there is, however hurt it will be by the US departure. It's very loosey-goosey. And people hope that ASEAN would maybe evolve and it's just a talk shop. So unfortunately not. Sanctions, we just have to do this better. There's a school of thought that says, oh, if sanctions are too hard, you know, stop doing it altogether. And they say it's like whack-a-mole. You know this game? I I drag my wife every year to the CNE. Though I think she likes it, but our first date was actually at the CNE, so years ago. Anyway, so you try to knock the moles that's coming up, and when you knock one down, it pops up. So this is sanctions evasion. My view is you just do sanctions better. You play whack-a-mole better. And you use AI, amongst other tools, to get at the sanction evaders. And you've got to get your industrial capacity back up and rational. Oh, one of the most controversial things in the book, I don't know about you, I'm getting really tired of these ransomware attacks like the one in southwestern Ontario. I think, yeah, I know it's going to be on tape, but what the hell? We should shut down Russia's internet for 20 minutes every time they do one of those. We should tell them. We should give them lots of warning. And NATO, if you look closely at some of the NATO subsites, there's some activity along those lines, but it's very opaque and it's very almost special forces. It's not like serious. We should just come out and get really muscular on cyber, not just defense. We're playing always defense, which we should continue, but I think we have to do some offense. Defense spending. At this thing last night, there was a Canadian diplomat, a German one, and the German one said, well, finally, we don't have to keep putting out these notes as to how our 1.5% is just as effective as 2. And the Canadian said, yeah, we're still doing that. That's what we still have to do. If we got up to 2, that's about 18 to 20 billion more a year, and you put 6 of that a year for 30 years into AUKUS. It's a big number, but I don't see how you're going to be relevant in the Pacific or in the North without those nuclear-powered subs. At the same time, I talk about we have to be careful about getting into non-optimal wars. With the greatest of respect to those of you who served in Afghanistan, we should have gone in, eliminated Al-Qaeda, and gotten out. Instead of, well, maybe we can actually make this country into a democracy. The Trump argument, which? Well, I think it's Trump. I think Obama got there finally. I think Biden is there as well. No. Very different. Protecting an existing democracy is hugely important. The rules-based international order is this global glue. I mean, let me just finish, and we can come back, but this is good. So I don't think I don't think the Americans should have done Iraq as well. They wanted to build a democratic South Korea in the middle of the Arab Middle East. That's hard. That's just so hard. I also think that he is actually over Russia and over China. He's the most significant global geostrategic threat right now. I also am very nervous about appeasers because, I mean, you're not reading your history if you're going down that route. And then where you end up is a decoupling, particularly on the technology side, which frankly, the Chinese started years ago, decades ago, and we just have to continue it. How does it end? I'm not going to do, that's the spoiler thing. You got to read the end of the book. what if Trump were to say to Ottawa, oh, by the way, everything I said about NATO, I also mean about NORAD. They built Northcom, like they have a parallel system for protecting themselves in the North. They don't really need NORAD. It's helpful, it's useful, but they don't really need it. And it was on this campus, I'll remind you, in 1938, that a US president said, don't worry, we've got your back, Canada. And what if that guarantee were to be pulled back? Anyway, and then the last thing I do is I walk through how there are sort of jobs for different folks. I think this is actually the toughest job for the Canadian military. It's maybe great to have those subs, but I did this for 35 years in the civilian sector, and this is a heavy lift. This is hard stuff. I remember steel plant clients that had 170 apps going to one ERP app. That's really hard work. And this is what we're going to have to do really, really quickly, because the Americans, I think, are getting there on a pretty good pace, and we're not. Cloud is huge. I'm very worried that we will lose our sovereignty to the US if all we do is piggyback on the American solution. Tech companies have to-dos, traditional companies. I have one client that has all of its eggs in the Chinese basket for production, and they're finding it incredibly difficult to move off to another ASEAN or regional. You can move the plant, but the componentry comes from China. You can move assembly of the iPhone to India, but there are literally 1,800 suppliers of bits and bobs from China and Taiwan. So if there's a conflict between China and Taiwan, I don't know how Tim Cook keeps producing iPhones. I don't know if you saw this a couple of years ago, Warren Buffett, who's a buy and hold kind of investor, he buys into TSMC. A few months later, he sells. And his line essentially was, love the company, don't like where it is. And you're starting to see pension funds, for the first time in a very methodical way, thinking through geopolitical sort of military risk as well as technology risk. The banks have work and lawyers have work. Okay. Well, that didn't take 30 minutes. Questions? Well, yes.
I think that all these things, the confusion between American isolationism, which never existed, and American unilateralism. It's American unilateralism that's the threat, not isolationism. Trump will deal with whoever he has to for American interests and will jettison allies in doing so. So he'll deal with China, he'll deal with Russia, but on American interests. So it's not America pulling out of the world that's the problem. It's America engaging exclusively on its own, the way it did in the 19th century. So that's just a point. I think we just people confuse it. America's never been isolationist, but it's fundamentally unilateralist. The other point.
So what was it doing on its own up until Pearl Harbor from 1939?
If you look at the 1930s, it was negotiating in arms control. You had the Dawes Plan. It was taking care of Latin America. You had Roosevelt was dealing with Latin America, and it was building up in the Pacific on its own, not in alliance. And that's, to me, that's the threat of a Trump administration. And this is why he appeals to so many Americans. He doesn't say we are not going to defend ourselves. We are not going to have a big military. He says we're going to do it on our own. Why should we placate allies like Canada? I may think you're probably right about NORAD. My second point is, under what circumstances would the Chinese block maritime traffic? Because usually a blockade of that is not a cause of war, it's a result of war.
No, I think it's just if the world was such that through voluntary agreement or through some application of force, the Chinese managed to secure the South China Sea, everybody coming out of the Malacca Strait, X dollars per pound of traffic. It's just sort of a toll gate concept. As well as, we don't like certain things coming through, or we're going to divert, or so on. Now, you can go around to a certain extent, but the costs go up. Sorry.
Going back to office, I'm sure recall the first time we did the nuclear sub-dance under Mr. Beatty, that was just totally crushed. And I do not think Canadians are ready to accept nuclear submarines in the military inventory. It's just not going to happen. Nuclear anything. That's
if the Perrin Beatty of today, who should be Rita Anand, but she was a little bit too forceful talking truth to power, in my view. I think Canadians are up for a dialogue around nuclear powered submarines. I know in Ontario, where we get, what, 60% of our electricity comes from nuclear. I'd be up for that discussion. I'm saying we haven't even tried that discussion. And I'd want to know what they did in Australia to get there, because they got there. And when they had their change of government to Labor, seamless. So it's like a whole of society has bought in. But I take your point. It needs a sell job, which, including on Ukraine, I don't think we've had.
the BD cell. We will not be a protector of the United States, which is basically still what we are. And if the Americans don't want to send them in self-protection, I'm sure that's not their
But there's also pre-February 2022 and post-February 2022. So that's one. The other one that we must get on, I think the last fighter pilot has already been born. She might be quite young, maybe only, in preschool. But when you look at the drone program that the Americans are running, Replicator in the States, that's how they're going to counter China. It's not by building big multi-ton ships. It's by drone multiplication, amplification. If you look at what the UK announced 3 days ago, billions of pounds into drones. So I'd like to think that Canada could be meaningful in drones. And I think the F-35 is maybe our last fighter jet. So
We've got enough time for just one question. So I'll hand over.
Yeah, I just wanted to push back on something you said, or the analysis about market cap and sales in assessing sort of the industrial base. There, counterexamples you could make. You gave the example of an NVIDIA chip going into a missile. I hope they're not putting those into ICBMs, because a 4-nanometer chip is not radiation hardened. The Aegis combat system is still running IBM chips from the 1990s. And it's not clear that if you put the latest 4-nanometer chips into an Aegis combat system, you get something better as a result. So I wonder to what extent that the very large market caps of companies like NVIDIA, which is largely due to consumer exposure, will translate into better, especially critical weapon systems like ICBMs, where the US, for instance, now, Lockheed is struggling mightily to build a successor to the Minuteman III. So just something that I would caution.
So Aegis, and there we go again. Our current ships, no Aegis. When the Americans and the Brits decided to finally launch some strikes against the Houthis, Canada signed the piece of paper that said, yeah, we're going to do this. And then our ship sort of quietly left the stage. Because without Aegis, you're actually a liability in a hot, active theater. CSC, 15 years from now, Aegis, yes. It's the 15 years between now and then. I think Aegis fundamentally was designed for the old pre-drone, pre-Ukraine missile world. I start the book with a missile scenario for Taiwan where we're talking, you know, several thousand fires in a day. And for that kind of load, it'll be a question whether even our 2 nano or 1.5 can handle that load. And particularly with, you know, the kill zone, you want right at the median line, right? Ideally. So that gives you about 4 minutes to do your assessment and your decision making on 1,000 missiles at a time. In fact, I think quantum will be the ultimate solution. And the good news is, for those of you that are more pacifist leaning, I actually think air defense with quantum can be so good that you could achieve something like, you know, a durable conventional deterrence effect that might eliminate a lot of military activity. But you're going to need speeds that are really way faster. Now, the Minuteman upgrades and so on. Again, I think those are, you know, well, or the Patriot more on the interceptor side for air defense. You know, they're still thinking of, you know, 1 or 2 targets. Whereas I think what Ukraine is teaching us is it's got to be layered and it's got to carry volume in a way that, you know, drone swarms and so on. We've never seen that. So one last thought, ChatGPT-5 that's coming out will blow your doors off, because for the first time, we've got ChatGPT 3, 5, and 4 teaching the next generation. So the chips that even now are coming off from NVIDIA are going to be antiquated relative to, and I think this is the wave process of the future. But it's an interesting thought as to how much you need right now. But I also think, and you'll see if you read the book, the Chinese can't keep up. So that would be sort of another reason to, even if it requires over design, because we can do that. And they've got one chip company that's not doing that well.
You'd all join me in giving a nice round of applause to George. Thanks.